So welcome everyone. We're back together for the Psalms of Lament with Dr. Rosann Catalano. And today we're going to talk in session 6 about Psalm 13 and Psalms 88, specific Psalms to examine and ponder and work through. So welcome Rosann, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Hello everyone, and it's good to be back. I hope you are having a blessed Lent and that you are rigorously praying these Psalms even when they may not make a whole lot of sense to you. In our last session, we talked about the structure of the lament, how what each of the components is, and how they relate to one another, and then most importantly, what they say or what we can conclude about the kind of faith that prays these kinds of prayers, and the way the prayer understands God and understands their relationship to God, and most importantly in the Psalms of Lament, how they understand God's relationship to the world of human pain or hurt. What is God's role, if you will, in that? So today we're going to look at Psalms 13 and Psalms 88. And I hope you will have in front of you each of these Psalms, because we're going to do a close reading of them. And I'm going to be pointing out various things, so it would be most helpful if you had Psalm 13 in front of you. Psalm 13 is considered one of the laments proper. You remember there are, under the category of lament psalms, there are several subcategories, right? Laments proper, psalms of confidence, psalms of thanksgiving, psalms of trust, cursing psalms. Psalm 13 and in fact Psalm 88, both of these are considered laments proper. So I'm reading, and I think you have in front of you the New Revised Standard Version. That's the one I sent you. If you're looking at another translation, then some of the words will be different. Please always remember that if you're reading an English translation, you're reading an interpretation, right? We're not transliterating word for word from Hebrew to English, right? Where anybody who's done any translating at all knows that they have to make decisions about what word to use, how to best communicate, the intent of the word, and it may be that in English, that word doesn't best communicate what the text is trying to say. So, I mean, always to keep in the back of your mind that any translation is always tentative, right? And therefore, we should not put all of our chips, if you will, on what this, well, the word here says this, that's what it says. Well, that's what the translator says it says. And so we should always keep that in mind. So let's look at Psalm 13. One of my favorites, by the way. In fact, when I wrote my doctoral thesis, I titled it, How Long, O Lord? Because I was writing on the Psalms of Lament. In any event, Psalm 13, I'll read it first, and then we'll do an analysis of it and to get together. It would be much more fun if we were in the same room, because it would be much more it would be interactive, not much more, it would be interactive. And that's the best way to study a text. But that will be for another time. We do the best we can given the constraints we have. So this is a reading from Psalm 13, the New Revised Standard Translation. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemies will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. So, how long, O Lord? Right away, you should know this is a lament of the Israelite tradition because it begins with the address to God. Remember that distinction I made in our last session, where the Israelite Psalms of Lament always call upon God and then immediately talk about what's wrong. Whereas the laments of the other ancient Near Eastern traditions call upon God and then praise him immediately. So that's a real big distinction, right? So Psalm 13 in its very first verse follows the structure of the lament with calling on God. How long, O Lord? So already you know something. It's been a long time, right? Whatever is the situation of the person praying this psalm, it's been a long time. Will you forget me forever? Now, what's interesting is the Hebrew is not forget at all. It is ignore,
Mm-hmm.
which is much more accusatory, right? Mm-hmm. Which already says something about this kind of faith. It's a faith unafraid. It has its piety and its relationship with God is built first and foremost on honesty. I say to you what is in my heart, even when what is in my heart is ugly, even when what is in my heart is mean, even when what is in my heart is disappointment with you. Whatever it is, I'm going to be honest when I'm talking with you. And in a sense, that's a really important thing to keep in mind in terms of the way in which the Psalms understand prayer. That the basis of prayer, the basis of these Psalms are built on a foundation of covenantal fidelity, where two parties, God and us, are in a covenantal relationship that is unbreakable. And therefore, what holds a covenantal relationship together is honesty. I mean, we could extrapolate in terms of analogous relationships we have with people who are significant in our lives. And we know that if we are not honest with them, that relationship won't sustain over time. And even when it's hard to be honest, ultimately we owe it to one another. We owe it to one another to be honest, because if a relationship is going to survive, it has to be built on honesty and on fidelity. Those are the two pillars, right? Knowing that the other will not walk away and promising to be honest. That those are the pillars upon which this faith is erected. And so think for a minute that the person praying is in distress, and we'll talk about this in a minute, and they turn to God out of that distress and they say, how long? How long are you going to ignore me? Now, questions in the Psalms of Lament fall under this interesting category called indirect accusation. In other words, you may be honest, but you're not going to be that honest, right? So if you were really honest, you would say, Not how long will you ignore me, but why have you ignored me, right? But instead you have this indirect accusation. Will you ignore me forever? Rather than, hey, by the way, you've been ignoring me and you've been ignoring me for a long time, like forever, right? So how long, oh Lord, will you ignore me? How long will you hide your face from me? This notion of what scholars call divine neglect, if you will. Huh? This question of this indirect accusation is very, very common in the Psalms. You'll find them throughout, so many of them. And the assumption is, which is really, I mean, enough to give us pause, huh? That you can question God. That you can, if you will, take God to task. I mean, the kind of power of this prayer, or what in Yiddish is chutzpah, right? The chutzpah of this prayer is that you get to talk to God and say, "What are you doing here? I thought we had a relationship, and I'm like suffering, and where are you?" Right? That's sort of a modern lament, but in essence, that's what this is saying. How long are you going to hide your face from me? How long am I going to bear pain in my soul? Now, there is no word for soul in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible. The word nephesh means the whole self. How long will I bear? Will my whole being, in other words, bear pain? That's the kind of intent. So how long will you hide your face from me? How long? Now, in the English, it's translated must I, but that's not the Hebrew. The Hebrew is will. It's the verb is will, not must. How long will I bear pain in myself, in my whole being? In other words, how long will my whole being be in pain? And how long will I have, the word is actually grief, but how long will I have grief in my heart? All day long? How long will my enemy have the upper hand, is really the translation of the Hebrew. So you see in this beginning of Psalm 13, the address to God, how long, O Lord? And then you see the complaint, right? Will you ignore me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear this pain in my whole self? How long will my enemies have the upper hand over me? No answer to the question, because the questions are directed to God. The implication, and this is really quite stunning, I think, the implication is God owes an answer, right? The anticipation is, the expectation is, I'm talking to you here, as they say in the movies, right? Hey, I'm talking to you here. Listen to me and answer me, right? Don't ignore me. Answer me. I am in trouble. I am in grief. Following the complaint, and notice again, remember what we said in the last session. The complaint is generic in the sense that you don't know the specifics of the pain or the suffering, which makes it possible for this prayer to be our prayer 3,000 years later, right? Because we can all fill in the blanks or the backstory, right? Because the complaint is, how long must I bear pain? How long will you ignore me? How long will I grieve? Following the complaint is the petition. Consider, actually the word is look at me, which I like much better than consider. But you can see where the translator wants to make nice, right? Consider is a much more polite way of addressing God. It's sort of the way you and I might think we're supposed to address God in prayer. Consider, if you don't mind, please, you know, kind of obsequiously, right? You're God, I'm not. If you have a chance to consider. Well, that's not the spirit of this faith. This faith says, look at me. And it's in the imperative, by the way. I mean, which is again interesting, right? It's not like if you have a chance, right? It's look at me. I'm in trouble. I'm calling out to you. I thought we have a prior relationship, right? Where you're my God, I'm your people. We're gonna like hang in together. I'm in trouble. I'm in deep trouble. I'm in deep grief. I've been crying out to you. How long do I have to cry to you before you answer me? How long? How long? Look at me. Answer me. Isn't that interesting? Giving God commands, right? Do it, in other words. I mean, think about whether you feel free enough in your own prayer life and in your own relationship with God to be that kind of honest, right? One of the interesting things about the Lament Psalms is that honesty, the most outrageous honesty, which we'll see in the next session, which is the honesty of cursing one's enemy, the roof doesn't fall down on you when you pray that kind of prayer, right? You're not smote from the heavens. You're not dust when that happens. That's not what happens, right? Answer me, God. Listen to me. Give light to my eyes, which is a nice way of saying restore my sight, right? Help me to see better. Why? Because if you don't, I will sleep the sleep of death, which is, remember, in the ancient Israelite way of understanding, to sleep the sleep of death is the ultimate and permanent separation from God. And so, do you want that, God? If that happens to me, I can't, on top of all the grief I bear, I just cannot fathom being permanently separated from you. That's what's happening to me if I'm not restored. And we don't know restored from what, right? Which is the genius again. Mm-hmm. However you want to fill in the blank of what you need to be restored by. Or I will sleep the sleep of death. And my enemies will say, I have prevailed. My foes will rejoice because I am shaken. In other words, sleeping the sleep of death are the consequences of God's not answering the lament. This is what happens. This is what's going to happen to me. Now, how extraordinary is that? That the one praying assumes God cares, right? I mean, of all that God is doing in the universe, the Psalm of Lament makes an outrageous claim that their situation of pain, their situation of suffering matters to God. Like me, just me, Rosann, it matters to God. And therefore there are consequences to your not listening, to your not hearing, to your not responding. So you got to do it because this is bad. This is going to be bad. The other thing, I'm pausing here for a minute, the other thing I want to say is to remember with laments. Laments are not pretty prayers that we that are intended for us to pray kneeling, and with our eyes closed, and sort of just saying the words. Laments grow out of a real, honest situation of extreme pain. They're the language. They're the prayer. They're the language of people in distress. And the reason I think they're so important is that we don't have, save for the lament tradition, where else do we go for prayer that expresses in how much pain we are in and what it feels like to be in that kind of pain and how desperate we are. And that's an important consideration, because when people are desperate, they tend to be unguarded, because what do they have to lose, right? The one who is praying is like, I'm already on the edge here. The waters are already up to my neck. My enemies are already rejoicing. What do I have to lose? I don't have time to make nice. I'm at the very edge. And if my speech offends, so be it. Do I get your attention? I mean, that's sort of the, in a sense, it flies against certainly the way this Catholic girl was brought up in terms of prayer, right? I don't know. My guess is we probably share a lot of that in your tradition and mine, that nothing is more important than piety. Mm-hmm. And a kind of piety that, well, this is a different kind of piety. I don't want to say it's not piety. What it is it's a challenge. These prayers are a challenge to the kind of piety that I was brought up with, where you would never ask God or command God. You may say, please, would you, although I am not worthy, all that kind of language, huh? But there's nothing here about I'm not worthy. Quite the reverse. The subtext here is I am worthy of your listening. Why? Because you and I are like in it together. So what are we doing here? And then after the petition, remember I mentioned that there was this moment between petition and the promise of praise. It's not in the psalm themselves, but one of the clues is the word but. And here, verse 5, but I trusted in your steadfast love. Notice the verb is in the past tense. In other words, I've been trusting in you. I've been trusting in your fidelity, in your hesed, in your faithfulness. I trusted in that. That's why I am praying to you. And then you have the promise. My heart will rejoice. The word is not salvation. That's a Christianized word. The word in Hebrew is deliverance. We are delivered from our suffering. My heart will rejoice in your deliverance. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. The word is really, he has been good to me. I like it much better. Bountiful sounds a little fussy. Right? So you have here, in a sense, in Psalm 13, the perfect template. It's as if the prayer was imposed upon the structure. It was actually the other way around, right? We study all the Psalms and deduce a structure. Address God, how long? How long will you? How long will you? How long will you? How long do I have to? Listen to me, answer me. Don't forget me. Don't ignore me. If you do, I will be permanently separated from you. Do not make that happen. But remember, I've always trusted in you. I've always trusted in you. In a sense, the psalmist is saying what the great Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann calls, he's trusting in God, remembering what it means to be God. Which is to say, the other name for God is God with us, God who delivers us. And in a sense, the lament, and many of them do this more clearly, but we don't have time to study all of them. They remind God of who God is. In some of the laments, you will have in that element of confidence. But you are the God of our ancestors. You are the God of our fathers and mothers. You are the God who delivered us out of. You are the God who brought us from Egypt into our land. You are the God who has sustained us. Remember all of that. Remember who you are. I mean, it's as if the only reason they're in this distress is because somehow God has forgotten who God is. Right? I mean, and whether God forgets or doesn't forget, who knows, right? But the point is that on this side of the relationship, it sure like seems you've just forgotten. And so if you need some reminding of who you are, remember, you're a God who delivers. You're a God whose steadfast love is made known to us.
I have a couple of thoughts about 13. What's interesting is I think the translators of the different Psalms, and the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer come from the English Reformation, King James Bible, the Coverdale Psalms that have been in our prayer book, except in a few places, kind of modernized. And it's interesting when you were reading the Revised Standard Version of 13, how both the translators decide which words, it's just too much to be truly honest in how you want to translate the Hebrew. So you kind of edge on certain words. So what was interesting in this one, in the prayer book version, instead of pain in verse 2, it's perplexity in my mind. Well, that just means I'm kind of confused, I'm not really in pain. That's just too far, that's too, And then in
excuse me, but what does that do? It sort of domesticates the prayer, right? It makes it acceptable. I'm perplexed. I'm not perplexed. My heart is grieved.
Right. So then and then in verse 4, instead of shaken, I am shaken, it's I've fallen. That's kind of, shaken is different than fallen, right?
Yeah.
So and then the mercy down in I'll trust in your mercy, not in verse 5, not steadfast love. So it's like, well, I'm just perplexed and you're merciful, not I'm in pain, and great pain, grieved to death, and I trust in your steadfast love. Steadfast love that's too frightening too. So we're just going to kind of bring it back.
I think there is that. There is, I think, the Christianizing of these Hebrew prayers, especially I think in the Episcopal and Roman traditions, pull back the language for reasons that actually are profoundly theological, which is another whole conversation, right? But they're not just because they like this word instead of that word. It's because their theology, the theology they represent, is a theology where we're creatures to the Creator. And therefore, the Creator owes us nothing. And so when we ask, we just ask if you would please, in your merciful goodness, consider us. When you study the Psalms or the prayers in the Hebrew Bible, what is so striking to me as a Roman Catholic Christian is that this way of visualizing one's relationship with God is much more standing face to face
Mhm.
It's the way people talk to one another.
Mhm.
People who love, who care, who are deeply committed to one another. It's how they talk to one another.
Mhm.
It's not, you know, if you would, I'm nothing. I'm worth nothing. I know I'm worth nothing, and I probably deserve everything, but in your mercy, if you could. That is so far removed from the power of these prayers, which is to call upon God to be God for them
Mhm.
as individuals and as communities. And one of the things that's so striking about that is the notion that that's the expectation, that God is involved in our world of hurt.
Mm.
And that doesn't come out of some crazy left field. It comes out of what we know about God from the way in which God acts in the Bible. God is the one who frees us from all of the things that diminish us, from all of the slaveries that diminish us. That's who God is. God delivers us, and God promises under every circumstance to be with us. And so when one is in dire straits, the question is, well, what happened here? Where are you? Right?
Yeah, I was thinking about what do we do when we're desperate, and I think that's one of the things I'm guessing we're getting to that when we do the Passion Gospel. But you know, there's a desperation in the Passion Gospel on all kinds of places, um, and there's everyone's in some way desperate for power, desperate for safety. Jesus even is desperate. And so I think that that's it makes sense that that's the focus of our holiest week of the year. Of course, there's more to it, but I know we're going to talk about that. But there are very few places that you go. I hadn't really thought about that. When you're desperate, what are the resources in your spiritual toolbox? And yeah, this is really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, and you know, it's interesting because it raises the question of, do you pray prayers that image your heart, whether you're joyful, whether you feel blessed, whether you feel desperate? Well, that's one thing we should do for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But those of us who come out of traditions where we have a strong sense of praying for others, not just for ourselves, it seems to me that part of our prayer should be, in fact, Walter Brueggemann has this wonderful, wonderful image when he talks about the laments and our own personal prayer. He says, when God wakes up in the morning and looks over all of creation, where do you think God pauses and looks and weeps? And it is in that place where you should lament for those people who may not be able to lament for themselves. So in other words, it's the other side of prayer. On the one side of prayer, you want to pray what's in your heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other side of prayer, you want to pray the words that someone else might pray who is desperate. In fact, one of the most stunning experiences I have ever had in the classroom is when Walter Brueggemann took the small seminar of us at the end of one of the seminars on the lament literature. And our assignment was to write a lament for someone that we know who is in pain. Write it for them in their voice.
Huh.
Not you write it for yourself, but imagine someone you love, or think about someone you love who is in distress, who is in serious distress, and now write a lament as if they could lament, so that they could lament, so that they could pray this prayer. It is an astonishing, I have done this exercise a number of times, and it really is, it's quite an astonishing exercise. So there's much more that can be said about each of these, right? You have a sense, I hope now, that, there are 150 Psalms. We could have 150 sessions plus 50, right? Yeah. To just plumb some of, just do the surface work on them. But we have one more Psalm we want to do in this session. Yeah. But before I turn to Psalm 88, Martha, anything else that is striking to you about this?
Well, I'm working on my sermon for this Sunday, and those of you that are listening to this after that, you'll see that, a lot of times how to learn how to speak with God about that is how we speak with people we trust the most, that we can just be our total self. And I'm going to talk a little, and of course, sometimes dear friends, partners, and children really teach you about all of that. And so I think, and there's this Netflix piece that I watched called Afterlife by Ricky Gervais, and it is, his wife died, and he's done what Rosann suggested. He says, well, what do I have left to lose? I'm just going to say to everybody what I really think. And so it's kind of gruesome what he does, but the most important thing was the people around him. They, like God, stay constant with him. So, and then he finds his way to resurrection. But it's a really fascinating thing about what the Psalms of Lament looks like in our everyday life. We do that, but not many of us do.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I guess part of it is, do we know enough to do it? Yeah. Are we familiar enough so that we can do it and not be afraid to do it? I would recommend, if you do not know this little book, I would recommend it to you. I don't know if you know Annie Lamott.
Oh yeah, Help, Thanks, Wow. Yes.
The book is called Help, Thanks, Wow, the 3 Essential Prayers. And she talks about praying in your own voice. So in other words, praying not conventional prayers like the Psalms, but rather praying out of your heart. And that the 3 prayers, the 3 forms of prayer are help me, thank you, and wow, you're spectacular. To that, I would add for our next session, help, thanks, wow, and I want to kill you.
Yes, right? That's probably, yes, right? That's right. Yeah.
And I want help, thanks, wow, and I want to kill you, by the way. But it's a small little book. It is a wonderful, wonderful meditation on speaking from the heart and forgetting about, the conventional prayers and how we should pray and the language we should use. Just talk to God. Just say, God, help me. I don't know what I'm doing here. Or today's been the best day. Thank you. Mm. Or I don't even know what I want to say, but I think you're pretty terrific, right? Whatever. And to kind of, and think about the familiarity that engenders in your relationship with the divine, right? Which is what I think prayer is really ultimately all about. So I recommend this for you. I want to turn now to Psalm 88, if you would look at that with me. And I am using, and you have it in front of you. In fact, I think I sent you 2 versions. One, the New Revised Standard, which is sort of the standard text that Christian, not all Christian churches, but churches out of the Reformed tradition, the Episcopal Church, the Roman Church, use. But the one I'm going to look at, and I want you to look with me, is the one from the Jewish Publication Society, the 1985 translation. And the reason I want to look at this one is because it is much, much more faithful to the translation, the translation is much, much more faithful to the Hebrew. And so anyway, we're going to look at Psalm 88. But because Psalm 88 is such an extraordinary prayer, as you will see, I want to offer a few introductory notes. Well, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do the reverse. I'm going to do the reverse. I am going to first have us study the psalm together and then offer some notes on the psalm. I think that makes more sense now that I talk to myself out loud in your presence. So Psalm 88. When the first time I studied this text with a group of people, the response I got from one woman was, "I hate this." And just like that. And I said to her, "Why do you hate this?" She said, "Because it's hopeless. It's hopeless." I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, because the question I want us to ponder at the end of this is, what is a hopeless prayer? What does that even mean, right? What is a hopeless prayer? Is Psalm 88 a hopeless prayer? Or is it a prayer that is at the utmost edge of despair? We'll come back to that question. But first, let's read Psalm 88. I will read it, and then we will do a line by line or verse by verse or several verse translation. Discussion. O Lord God of my deliverance, when I cry out in the night before you, let my prayer reach you. Incline your ear unto my cry, for I am sated with misfortune. I am at the brink of Sheol. I am numbered with those who go down to the pit. I am a helpless man, abandoned among the dead, like bodies lying in the grave, of whom you are mindful no more, and who are cut off from your care. You have put me at the bottom of this pit, in the darkest places, in the depths. Your fury lies heavy on me. You afflict me with your breakers. You make my companions shun me. You make me abhorrent to them. I am shut in and do not go out. My eyes pine away from affliction. I called you, O Lord, each day. I stretched out my hands to you. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise to praise you? Is your faithful care recounted in the grave, your constancy in the place of perdition? Are your wonders made known in the netherworld, your beneficent deeds in the land of oblivion? As for me, I cry to you, O Lord. Each morning my prayer greets you. Why, O Lord, do you reject me? Why do you hide your face from me? From my youth I have been afflicted and near death. I suffer your terrors wherever I turn. Your fury overwhelms me. Your terrors destroy me. They swirl about me like water all the day long. They encircle me on every side. You have put friend and neighbor far from me, and my companions are out of sight. So first, I want you to think with me about the situation of this person. What's the situation they're praying out of? There's a kind of despair that has no hope. Let me point out before we begin that most commentators don't comment on the psalm. They ignore it. And they ignore it by saying the following. Well, you know what? It doesn't have all of the elements of a lament psalm. It only has an address to God and a complaint. So this isn't somehow in the transmission of the psalm, the rest of the prayer must have gotten lost. You know, the prayer of confessing confidence, the prayer of being assured, the prayer of petition, and then the promise of praise. It's sort of an incomplete prayer, and so we're not going to pay any attention to it. Well, if you've been paying attention at all over the past 6 sessions, you probably know my answer to that response, and that is nonsense. This is a prayer that is in our Bible. This prayer, the people who put our Bible together believed was worthy of being part of the collection. So I want to take it for what it is, that some committee way back when the Bible was put together, when they were collecting all these prayers and deciding which should go in and which should not, I imagine there was a huge struggle and argument about whether this prayer should be part of the Book of Psalms. That it is included is itself extraordinary, because it is, as one of my students said to me, it's such a downer. It's such a downer, right?
I wanted to add something here. I don't know if it's out of place, but one of the things that I immediately thought about, let me put this back there. I immediately thought about at the end, my friend and my neighbor you have put away from me, and darkness is my only companion. Of course, I'm preparing for the stripping of the altar and tenebrae that we do right afterwards, and the lights going out. And it just seems like it's at the heart of the deepest part of our liturgies. So I just wanted to make that.
Yeah, and you know what? I really appreciate that, because I think we don't pay enough mind, in fact, to the fact that within our liturgical cycle, we approach this darkest part of us.
Mm-hmm.
But when we couch it in liturgy, sometimes we lose the power of it because it's a service at 7:30, right? Yes. But I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think Tenebrae and Good Friday are 2 examples of our tradition facing a darkness that sees no light.
Yeah, and you know, we take that candle away at the end. Of course, I bring it back out at the end of it, but that moment I could actually see this year saying part of this. instead of doing the Song of Zechariah or whatever's at the end, is actually doing this and saying, and darkness is my only companion.
And what, you know, one of the things that always annoys me about Tenebrae, although I love the service, but what annoys me about it is that Christian necessity of rushing to resurrection.
They're bringing the light back out.
We can't stay in the darkness. We have to hurry up and bring a candle back in. We have to make a big noise so that the tomb is shut, but the candle is coming back in. We can't live in the darkness. And the fact of the matter is, how many live in darkness? Unrelenting darkness. That it's not a liturgy for them, right? It's a reality. And shouldn't our liturgies help us live in uncomfortable places for a few minutes, where half of the world is living all of the minutes of their lives, right? So, I mean, you know, my worst self wants to say, well, so what if you're uncomfortable? You know, get over yourself. You know, think about people for whom darkness is their only friend.
Yep.
So I feel that way about Tenebrae, and I'm like a crazy person when it comes to Good Friday and Holy Saturday. I'm the people in my congregation just say, stay away from her. Don't let her get on the committee. don't give her any voice, because we know she's going to be like a crazy person. Okay, let's look at Psalm 88. So there is the address. It's a prayer. It's calling on God. That's what makes it a prayer. Not what else is going on. The prayer doesn't say, would somebody please help me? No, that's not a prayer, or maybe it is, I don't know. But this is calling on God. That's a prayer. And the person praying it says it's a prayer. So don't say it's not a prayer. Oh Lord God of my deliverance, my deliverance. I cry out in the night. Let my prayer reach you. Listen when I cry. Incline your ear, right? Listen when I cry. This is someone who knows who God is. God is the God of deliverance. And the one praying is addressing God with that name. God of my deliverance. This is who the prayer knows God to be. So why is God not God for this person? That's the question, right? I'm abandoned, I'm desolate, I'm diminished. This is someone, for I am sated with misfortune. I'm like fed up. I'm like up to here with misfortune. I am on the brink of Sheol. And what is Sheol in the Hebrew Bible? It's not hell. Sheol is a kind of, it's not a place, like a physical place. It's a way of being alive that has no life in you, where you're like a shadow. It's the place my father was after my mother died. He was a shadow of himself. He was alive. He had a heartbeat. He had a heartbeat. So medically he was alive, but he knew no joy. He went through the motions. He was a shadow. So what this person is saying, I'm on the brink of having every single part of my spirit removed from me. I am already numbered with those who have gone down to the pit, who have died. I am a helpless man. I am abandoned among the dead, like bodies already lying in a grave. I mean, think about, this is how this person perceives herself, right? I am someone of whom you are mindful no more. Think about that. I am someone that you don't think about anymore. I'm cut off from your care. And then, so the first part of this, one of the ways I like to study the psalm is to circle the pronouns. So in the very beginning, verses 1 through 5, whatever, it's I cry, my prayer, incline my cry, for I am sated, I am on the brink, I am numbered with those, I am helpless, I am abandoned, I am one whom you are mindful no more, I am one who is cut off. Now look, you have put me, right? So before we start this part is a profound accusation of God's not being God. This is very dangerous speech. But what does this person have to lose? Remember, this is someone who has been in this situation of suffering since they were young, and now they're old. This is not, it happened yesterday and I'm beside myself, right? You have put me at the bottom of the pit. You have put me in the darkest places. You have put me in the depths. Your fury lies heavy. You afflict me. You make my companion shun me. You make me abhorrent. I am shut in and do not go out. The Hebrew, interestingly, there is, I am imprisoned and cannot get out. My eyes, they don't pine away, they ache. The Hebrew is ache. My eyes ache from affliction. And then in the Hebrew, these verbs are in the past tense. I called you, O Lord, each day. I stretched out my hand. I did all those things, right? And now, having accused God, listen to this incredible turn. Now the one praying is going to ask God a bunch of questions. Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to please you? Is your faithful care recounted in the grave and your constancy in the place of perdition? Are your wonders made known in the netherworld, your beneficent deeds in the land of oblivion? So what kind of questions are these? What's the motive? What's the intent of these questions? Some scholars, most scholars say these are rhetorical. These are rhetorical questions. And then depending on whether you're Jewish or Christian, you're likely to answer them differently. Do you work wonders for the dead? No. Yes. Do the shades rise up to please you? Well, yeah, because we've been raised to new life. No. Is your faithful care recounted in the grave? These are scary questions. I want you to see them for the kind of scary questions. They are scary because suppose they're not rhetorical. Suppose they're real questions that I want you to answer. Suppose they're real questions that the one suffering from their youth is asking God. Do the dead praise you? Because if the dead don't praise you, then you better keep me alive because it is the living who praise you. And God, to praise God is the highest form of being in relationship, right? Does God care for the dead? I mean, one could argue in a kind of cranky Christian way that the resurrection is precisely that God can't tolerate death, right? That it is an affront. It is an affront to life. and the power of life. And so it's the living that praise God. It's the living that call on God. And when you're severed from God, you can do none of those things. When you're in the grave, you can't recount the deeds of God. When you're in the grave, you can't talk about the constant care of God or the wonders that God has made known. These are things the living do. And then verse 14, in quite a remarkable turn. As for me, so there's been this long accusation beginning in verse, 4 maybe. I am numbered, no, where? Verse 6 maybe. You have put me at the bottom of the pit. You, all those lines beginning with you, but I. As for me, that may be who you are, but I cry out to you, O Lord. It's a prayer. Every morning I pray. Why do you reject me? Why do you hide your face from me? I have been afflicted from my youth and near death. And then it ends with another accusation of God. I suffer your terrors, your fury overwhelms me, your terrors destroy me, they swirl about me. You have put my friend and neighbor far from me, and my companions out of my sight. Whatever the situation of this person, it has been for an extraordinarily long period, and it is such that his friends have abandoned him. His companions have left him. His neighbors don't attend to him. His community has failed him. I remember studying this many, many years ago during the AIDS crisis. And let me tell you how powerful it was with that as a background. But today, with the kind of hate and the deep, deep problems we have in our country, is our community failing us? Is our community failing our neighbor? In this latest spate of hate crimes against Asians, where 90-year-old men and 85-year-old women are beaten and spit on and killed and mutilated because they're Asian. Are we protecting them? His community has failed him. His friends has failed him. God has failed him. One might say in conclusion, he has nothing. But I would leave you with this. He has his integrity. He knows himself to be a person of faith. She is someone who believes in God, whether or not God continues to believe in her. In other words, think about this, that the faith of this person is not dependent on whether God is faithful. That is like the scariest kind of faith going. That is like hanging out there, right? So faith is not, in this psalm, the challenge is, faith is not a quid pro quo. I'll be this, you be that. If I pray, you deliver. If I'm good, you'll bless me. Right? All those kinds of quid pro quo. This is not a quid pro quo. I pray because that's who I am. That's who I am in the deepest part of me. If you choose, God, to be unfaithful to who you are, that's on you. That's a pretty radical prayer. But it is also a profoundly stunning example of how deep the notion of being a faithful person is. That in spite of everything, I call on you. It's as if the one praying has so little to lose that they're forcing God to be God. I have nothing to lose. You're the one, right? Do we have a few minutes for kind of a wrap up? I've lost track of time.
Yeah, we've been going for a while, but yes, this is very good. So wrap up, and then we'll.
Okay, let me just wrap up with a couple of things here. So this is a prayer, I think, that displays fidelity, which is as resilient as it is vulnerable, as courageous as it is tenacious, a faith that hopes more than it despairs. Not that it doesn't despair, but it hopes more than it despairs. It yet hopes in the midst of desolation that God will be God. I would ask you just to live with this prayer for a while, because it challenges us Christians who, as we've said, are so anxious to get to Easter Sunday in everything. It's like, it's as if our tradition doesn't provide us with an opportunity to live in the darkness. Darkness has been conquered, but it's darkness. And if you eliminate the darkness, you have made light of the power of the resurrection. Do we shy away from this because we're uncomfortable with pain and suffering of others? We don't like people who talk like that. I mean, they make us uncomfortable because we don't have the answers to why. Because it's unseemly. In the end, God, I suspect, wants from us two things. To stay connected and to be honest. In the direction of God, and in the direction of the world, we know what God wants. To feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to bury the dead, to visit the sick, to give drink to the thirsty, to take care of those in prison. Right? So when we're facing out, that's what we're supposed to do. When we're in prayer facing God, be there and be honest. Use your words and say what is in your heart. And I think the Lament Psalms are the example par excellence of a tradition that that gives us that gift. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next session when we curse.
Yes. Thank you all, and thank you, Rosann.
Thank you, everybody.